Welcome to Intellings, where we explore nonfiction books through news, reviews, and interviews with the minds behind them. Today, we are diving into one of the world's most contested regions, the South China Sea. Our guest is Professor John Rennie Short, a leading voice in geopolitics and global studies. His new book, Hedging and Conflict in the South China Sea, unpacks the complex dance between diplomacy, defense, and national interest in Asia's most strategic waters. So let's dive in. Professor Short, your new book, Hedging and Conflict in the South China Sea, came out this year. What was the primary motivation behind dedicating an entire work to this specific topic now?
Yes, well, it comes into the news regularly now because of various conflicts and interactions. But what I was interested in was moving the debate away from the reliance on either the Chinese or the US perspectives. Often it's framed in terms of the conflict between the two superpowers, and I was interested in looking at how this impacted countries in the region, the smaller countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. So the aim was to look at the role of these smaller countries that are often ignored when people just concentrate on the US-China conflict.
In your introduction, you state the South China Sea is a geopolitical hotspot. How do you define geopolitical hotspot in this context? And why does the South China Sea fit this definition so acutely?
So a geopolitical hotspot is similar in metaphorical terms to a geological hotspot, a part of the Earth's surface which is prone to the possibility of explosion, volcanoes, earthquakes. The South China Sea is a geopolitical hotspot because it's a confrontation between China and the US, with the possibility of spiraling out into further forms of conflict. So a geopolitical hotspot is where major ruptures in international relations can occur. And that's what the South China Sea is, because there's both a real and ongoing conflict between two superpowers, with the possibility of it escalating into even more serious conflict.
Your book aims to unpack the conflicting and competing interpretations of the South China Sea. Could you elaborate on one of the most significant misconceptions or oversimplifications you encountered in your research?
Yes, I think it was the main thing I discovered a misunderstanding of the perspectives of the two main protagonists. For China, sees the South China Sea as a core issue for the defense of the country. It sees it as absolutely vital to its self-interest and concerned with the notion of it being constrained and kept down by the US. From the US perspective, they have a notion that the high seas should be free to open navigation. And they see it as China's sort of demarcation of a personal space, which they find difficult to accept. And so you have two very conflicting views, and anything that either one does to advance their respective interests is seen as an attack by the other one. So China sees any incursion of US Navy into South China Sea as a confrontation. It's a direct threat. Whereas the US sees any attempt to stop freedom of navigation as an attack on the rules-based order. So both of them are in a difficult position because they see the actions of their protagonists in very zero-sum games. If someone wins, the other one loses. There seems to be very little point of space for conflict resolution. So that was the main thing. It seems to be an explosive situation because there seems to be very little space or language, really, for them to appease their competing imaginaries.
Beyond the overt military and territorial disputes, what are some of the less visible, yet equally significant aspects of conflict in the South China Sea that your book brings to light?
I think one of the things is how important it is as a resource for the surrounding countries. In the case of both Vietnam and Malaysia, it's significant source of oil and gas reserves, which are very valuable to middle income countries. Not only that, but for both Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam is also important fishing reserves. So the South China Sea is not just an arena for conflict between the US and China. It's also an important, very important resource base for surrounding countries, both in terms of oil and gas reserves and also in terms of fishing. Most of the fish eaten in the Philippines, for example, comes from the South China Sea. So it's an important source of both protein and natural gas and oil.
How do you believe your work distinguishes itself from other academic analyses of the South China Sea conflict? What unique perspective do you offer?
So I think it's obviously been a subject of a lot of interest, the South China Sea, but the vast majority of work looks at it in terms of the superpower rivalries. They look at the competing competition between the US and China for dominance in the region. And I thought I could do a valuable job by extending our understanding by looking at the perspectives, the positions of the other smaller countries, all ASEAN members, but particularly Vietnam and Malaysia, Philippines, and to a lesser extent Indonesia, who all have significant interests in this area. And they were often ignored in much of the analysis because most of the analysis was coming from either a Chinese or a US perspective. And I felt that the role and significance of these smaller countries was ignored in much of the previous research and writings on the subject.
You define hedging in the context of international relations, particularly as it applies to smaller states in the South China Sea? How does it differ from traditional alliance building or bandwagoning?
So hedging is a specific term which refers to the attempt by smaller countries to navigate their relations with two competing powers. In this case, it's how do they manage to find a livable position between China and the US while still promoting their own interests. There's a variety of different technical terms. Bandwagoning means that you go all in for one country. In this case, in Southeast Asia, Laos, and Cambodia tend to be much more pro-Chinese. They're very close to China, both physically and economically and politically. So that's a form of bandwagoning. They tend to support China and China's position. Hedging is whereby you try to navigate between the two for your own interests. So in the case of Vietnam, Vietnam wants to protect its exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea, which tends to align with the US, but it also has to do economic relations with China. So hedging is navigating these two superpowers, and you can do it quite effectively. 2023, if I remember right, Vietnam hosted visits from Xi Jinping and President Biden. Both of them were interested in gaining support from Vietnam, and Vietnam could turn that desire into favorable economic relations. So hedging is the ability of smaller countries, often a necessity, to navigate without alienating two competing powers.
Your book specifically examines the hedging strategies of ASEAN members. What common threads or variations did you observe in the approaches of countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam?
So the similarities are the reality of China is that for many of the countries, their most significant and important economic partner. So often the rise of the middle class in these countries and the increase in wealth is based on economic ties with China. However, they're all worried about China having too much control And so they want to have connections with the United States in order to sort of leverage benefits from either country. So all of the countries have that basic context. They do it differently. Malaysia, for example, tends to be much quieter in promoting its national interest in the South China Sea, preferring to avoid any conflict or any even, rhetoric that mentions that. Vietnam takes a slightly different position, much stronger rhetoric about its national interest in the South China Sea, but without connecting with military alliances with the United States. The Philippines, in contrast, has moved, zigzagged its position. Under two previous regimes, presidencies, Arroyo and Duterte, it tended to take a more pro-China view. However, the current presidency, Marcos Jr., takes a much more, not so much a sort of anti-Chinese view, but promotes Filipino national interest much more strongly than, say, the previous president, Duterte. So in some ways, Philippines has moved away from not so much either hedging or bandwagoning, but in a sense, a rebalancing towards a much more explicit articulation of its national interest in China's incursions. And that's encouraged a move towards the United States. There's been agreements 2014, 2023 about increasing US access to military bases in the Philippines. And so you can see that continuum from Malaysia, very quietly hedging, Vietnam, a bit more, it's called heavy hedging, still maintaining links with China, but still asserting its rights in the South China Sea. And the Philippines, which is basically rebalanced towards a much more pro-US perspective.
Is hedging a sustainable long-term strategy for these states? Or does it become increasingly difficult to maintain as the US-China rivalry intensifies?
Well, as the rivalries intensifies, it becomes kind of difficult. It becomes either choose one side or the other, but they've been fairly successful in managing it so far. The problems will come about when their national interests are much more directly threatened. So we can take the case of Malaysia, which, as I said, had been very quiet about its claims in the South China Sea, and especially China's claims over Malaysia's exclusive economic zones. This wasn't much of an issue when most of Malaysia's oil and gas exploitation was close to the shore and very close to, it wasn't outside its or far from the shoreline. But as you know, these reserves are used up. Malaysia has to push further away from the shore out into, still within its exclusive economic zone, but now it will increasingly occur in what China sees as their maritime zone within the 9-dash line of China. So issues will get more pronounced, I think, as the competition for the resources in the South China Sea increase. Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia all have important reserves within their exclusive economic zones, but also within the area claimed by China. So the hedging will get more difficult when their national interests run up against the Chinese military might in the area.
What are the primary internal and external factors that influence a nation's decision to adopt a hedging strategy in the South China Sea?
So the main, the internal ones are for the political elites. They depend on, growing economic economic growth to, maintain their legitimacy. So all countries need a connection with China. China's been a source of trade, investment, which has, boosted economic growth, made people richer. So they need to maintain that, and they need to maintain their economic ties with China. However, their legitimacy also comes about through promoting and protecting national interests. And so you can see this need to both maintain economic growth, but also, protect their national interest, especially in terms of assets, resource assets in the South China Sea. So it's that balance between keeping good, strong economic ties with China as a form of economic growth, which keeps you in power, but also if your national interest is seen to be transgressed by China, you also lose legitimacy. And so you can see in the case of, it's easier for the Philippines to promote their national interest because they have less economic ties with China and more with the US. Vietnam, in contrast, the bulk of its economic connections are with China, and especially as the US embarks on a sort of extreme tariff policy, which punishes Vietnam. Vietnam then has to avoid alienating China because it may have difficulty accessing the US market. So you can see the kind of complex balance and dance they have to do, for there's both competing internal and external factors at work.
Are there specific examples of successful or unsuccessful hedging strategies by ASEAN members that you highlight in your book? And what lessons can be drawn from them?
Probably the most successful, I think, is Indonesia. Indonesia has a lot of economic ties with China. China is the biggest single source of foreign investment, and it's been involved in infrastructure, new railway lines, for example, exploitation of mineral resources. So Indonesia has a very strong economic ties with China. However, it also has an area in the Tuna Islands, which is within Indonesia's exclusive economic zone, but China claims much of that territory. And what Indonesia has done has been to not back down from this, sending in warships and fighter aircraft when it sees incursions, but keeping it quite quiet, not making it a big deal. In other words, they're not using global public opinion to, shame China in any sense, but neither are they backing down. So Indonesia successfully managed to, sustain its national interest without alienating China. That would be the best case, but it's a relatively small area for Indonesia, unlike, say, for the Vietnam, where all of its oil and gas reserves are claimed by China, and by the Philippines, which sees a direct incursion. So Indonesia's the best example of, keeping it quiet, not using it to generate criticism of China, but not backing down from China. So that would be the best example of hedging, I think. Philippines has moved away. Philippines, I think, under a previous presidency and the current one, Marcos Jr., has basically moved away from hedging, I think, and towards rebalancing. It sees the incursions of China into its exclusive economic zone as so severe that it raises global public opinion, reinforces its alliances with the US, and in the process alienates China. So Indonesia and Philippines provide us with two competing examples of how countries can hedge or rebalance or cope with the difficulty of China's economic power, but the military security that the US could provide.
How do the competing imaginaries of China and the United States, as you describe them, shape their respective approaches to the South China Sea and, consequently, influence the hedging strategies of regional states?
A very good question, very complex question. I'll try to do my best to answer it. China sees the South China Sea as absolutely necessary for its security, both its economic security, bulk of its trade moves through South China Sea, and military security. It sees a US always trying to contain and constrain it. So China wants to push US naval power out into the mid-Pacific. It sees it as an existential threat if it can't do that. The US, on the other hand, sees freedom of navigation as an important part of the global order. And any attempt to close off the open seas is a direct attack on this principle. And so both of them have a completely different perspective, with obviously not much room for compromise. China doesn't want to see any US naval ships in the South China Sea, and the US is determined to still keep a presence in the South China Sea. That stark difference makes it difficult for countries in Southeast Asia that are not bandwagoning with either side to kind of find a working agreement around that. And what you can see is how they've tried to come up with ASEAN has tried to come up with a code of conduct, which has been just a talking shop for years and years and years because it looks so intractable. The direct comparison between the different imaginaries allows very little room for maneuver. And so the countries tend to try to fudge the issue in some way, because if you accept the United Nations Convention on the UNCLOS, it's called, if you set their ruling, it goes against China. If you go with China, if you accept their 9-dash line, if you're Vietnam or Philippines or Malaysia, you're going to lose out on national interest of, valuable resources. So it's a very complex issue. And the main problem is how you deal with China's claim, which directly impacts your national resources.
What role does the concept of rules-based international order play in the U.S. narrative regarding the South China Sea? And how does China counter this narrative?
So the U.S., upholds global rules-based order, but in this case, it's more specific. It's two issues. One is the principle of freedom of navigation, which is the high seas should be open to free movement. Countries have an ability, close to their coast, but once you're out in the open seas or high seas, it should be open for global trade. So America sees that as absolutely fundamental part of a global trade system. It also it has accepted the UNCLOS ruling, which is countries have a exclusive economic power over the sea 200 nautical miles out from your coastline. Now, interestingly enough, the United States did not sign the UNCLOS Convention for a variety of other reasons, but it upholds it in principle, even though it didn't sign the actual agreement. On the other hand, China sort of signed the UNCLOS agreement, but doesn't abide by it in the case of the South China Sea. The UNCLOS ruling says 200 nautical miles is your exclusive economic zone, but China's 9-dash line cuts into the EEZs of, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and basically says this is China's. So that goes against the rules-based order in that, and also in terms of the freedom of navigation. So China says it's big, it's powerful, and it's asserted it's a power enough, so it's affected a new reality. So the US is upholding rules-based order, freedom of navigation, UNCLOS ruling, and China is going against both.
How has China's increasing assertiveness, particularly its island-building activities, impacted the calculus of hedging for neighboring countries?
It's made it more important to to hedge to countries that provide some maybe form of security against this Chinese assertion. So Vietnam has obviously a very difficult long history with the United States, but more recently has encouraged US aircraft carriers regularly visit Da Nang, for example. Vietnam's kind of become closer to the US in the last 20 years with trade relations. Vietnam does not have any military alliances with anyone, but is encouraging visits of US aircraft carriers is a subtle message to China, I think, that, Vietnam has other friends. So I think that China's assertiveness has made countries keep the form of hedging alive, so that you can't become too dependent on China because they've been quite so assertive. The most obvious counter has been the Philippines, who just got so fed up with Chinese claims, building bases, the gray zone activity of the coast guards and the Chinese fishing fleet just, taking over islands within Philippines' exclusive economic zones. They basically forced the hand of the Philippines to move closer to the United States. In some ways, China kind of, I think, made a mistake in overplaying its hand. It became so assertive that it annoyed the other countries to an extent that they felt that their only way to respond, or one way to respond, was to, make closer relations with the United States, basically as a form of insurance. Now, whether it will work or not is another matter. But, China sort of was very aggressive for a while, and not only in taking islands, militarizing them, but there was also a very aggressive rhetoric. There was a era known as wolf diplomacy, when Chinese spokespeople were, rather than the, sort of Mandarin style restrained rhetoric, became very aggressive. I mean, it's stopped now, but it annoyed so many countries. I remember speaking to senior Filipino diplomats who said China was so annoyed that Philippines taking them to the Permanent Court of Arbitration that they tried to humiliate the Philippines at every opportunity, which reinforced the Philippines' movement towards the US. And there's significant, it was a mistake because there was significant, support for closer ties with China through different presidencies, but also, the Philippines have a long resistance to US bases and US military power in the region. And so I think China lost an opportunity because their assertiveness was so heavy-handed that it alienated many countries.
In what ways does the United States freedom of navigation operations influence the dynamics of hedging and conflict in the region? Are they effective in their stated goals?
I'm not quite sure what. Yes and no. So, in some sense, their stated goals is to fly the flag, to show that they will not be bullied by China and they will maintain freedom of navigation exercises. But I think they're more theatrical. I once said to a US naval senior officer, "Why do you do this? All it seems to do is to annoy China." And his response, "Well, that's a good enough reason." So they're happy to annoy China. Some of the allies are slightly worried about it, though, because you're involving very high-end military assets. Strike forces, aircraft strike forces are major military hardware, aircraft carrier, support vessels, fighter jets. A lot of things could go wrong if you come across a recalcitrant, Chinese Coast Guard. So it's one argument against it. It's sort of doesn't solve many problems, but it creates the possibility of a mistake happening. All you would need would be, one Chinese fishing vessel to get in the way of an aircraft carrier, or you could imagine, a sort of small incident being the fuse for a larger conflict. So freedom of navigation exercises, fly the flag, they're a sort of irritant to China, but they're not a deterrent. And so many people worry about their they're theatrical, but are they effective? And they also could be slightly dangerous, more than slightly. It could be very dangerous.
Looking ahead, do you foresee a shift in the United States or China's strategies that might fundamentally alter the viability of hedging for ASEAN nations?
Yeah, I think one of the things as you look at what's happening in the United States now, many of the countries, Vietnam in particular, had become very connected to the U.S. economy. It was major exporter to the U.S. market, and under Trump, the kind of new, sometimes punitive tariffs make the countries reassess their relationship with the US. Not only the tariff policies punish, middle income countries, but also the sense in which, can the United States be relied upon to have a consistent policy? So, the administrations, you move from Trump to Biden, back to Trump again, and often with very diverging policies towards Southeast Asia. Trump's first administration basically ignored Southeast Asia. Biden made stronger moves, but the United States has become less of a reliable partner insofar as its internal politics means often drastic changes in foreign policies. That's not the case with China. China is much more understandable, even if you dislike it. It's where it's coming from. They're concerned with economic ties, claims over the South China Sea, but they don't get involved in internal affairs. And as long as Xi Jinping's in power, you're going to have a consistency. The United States democratic system will change governments often, but America first policy, can you rely on the United States to come true if, push comes to shove? So in many ways, the hedging has to take into account, one, the changeability of the United States. Are they a reliable long-term partner? Would you hedge so much towards the United States under, say, Trump, and then there's a new election and the next president has a different view? So I think the unreliability of consistent foreign policy in the US will make countries reconsider what's the cost and advantages of hedging too much towards a United States, which in the next presidential administration may have an entirely different set of priorities.
What is the significance of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, in the South China Sea disputes? And how do different claimants interpret its provisions?
So the UNCLOS is the short acronym, makes it easier to say it. UNCLOS provides a sort of Cartesian solution to the problem of countries sharing the same sea. And the solution is countries are given an exclusive economic zone up to 200 nautical miles out from their coast. And most countries would agree with that, seems fair, but the other countries could all agree to that, I think, but China will not agree to that because under that ruling, they would not have control or exclusive economic control over much of the South China Sea. EEZ would be restricted to a couple of hundred nautical miles from Hainan Island, for example. And so China's 9-dash line basically says we're not going to abide by that ruling. And that's a fundamental issue, I think. And that's at the heart of the conflict, especially punishing for countries like Vietnam and Philippines who rely on the sea and who basically China does not accept the UNCLOS ruling in this matter. I think it's and China's claim, claim is fairly lame. In fact, it doesn't bear much scrutiny. And so the UNCLOS provides a solution, but it's not, to competing claims, but China will not accept that solution. And there's doesn't seem to be any way forward in that regard. The only way I think it could be forward is if you had like a dual system whereby China says, this is ours, but then in another sense still allows exclusive economic zones of other countries, but claims sort of strategic, dominance in some way or other. So I think that if there is a solution, it's going to be some fudged sort of dual understanding where we'll give China the rhetoric of the 9-dash line, but the economic reality is exclusive economic zones are adhered to and honored.
Despite the Philippines' 2016 arbitration victory, enforcement remains a challenge. How does the lack of effective enforcement mechanisms for international law impact the dynamics of conflict and hedging?
Sure, it's the UNCLOS provided a ready-made solution in terms of this designation of exclusive economic zones, but there was no form of implementing this or policing this or monitoring this. And it remains the central problem that how do you implement it when you have an aggressive China basically taking over islands? Now, other countries are doing the same. Vietnam is militarizing islands, off its coast. And there's really no form of policing or implementation. The only response of Vietnam has been to take over islands in the Paracels. The other one is Philippines has made it a sort of aggressive transparency. So what you do is you see lots of news images of Chinese Coast Guard in Filipino waters. And that's because the government's decided that, excuse me, there's an asymmetry in naval power, and they counterbalance that with trying to garnish global public opinion by releasing all kinds of footage of aggressive Chinese Coast Guard behavior. So the lack of implementation of UNCLOS is the Achilles heel of the area. And countries have had, resorted to, militarizing islands as well. In the Philippines, there's also a more populist approach. Often, demonstrations will occur when people will, take to boats and go out and take food to Filipino fishermen and confront Chinese Coast Guards, or Chinese Coast Guards will confront these flotillas. And I think that's where the danger is. You asked me about the geopolitical hotspot earlier on, and that's where the danger is. Low-level actors, uncoordinated, be caught up in the moment, something bad happens, fishing boat is rammed, fishermen are killed, or flotilla is attacked. Loss of life, national prestige. You can see how this can get out of control.
Your book discusses trajectories of conflict. What are the most likely scenarios for the evolution of the South China Sea conflict in the next 5 to 10 years? Are we more likely to see escalation, de-escalation, or continued stasis?
I probably have a different answer depending on which day you ask me that question. So I move between the sense of, we'll have a steady stasis of China's kind of stopped island building in a sense, but has solidified its position. There's a new reality of Chinese bases throughout the South China Sea, but Filipino resistance will still occur. So will Vietnam's resistance still occur. Well, the stasis will be an unstable stasis of continual, conflict and, aggressive interaction. So maybe the stasis will just be more of the same. The other one would be, much more darker. It becomes more of an issue with an unforeseen small incident sparking off a bigger conflict that could easily happen. The other thing could well be some form of I don't think there's clearly a resolution. This is what's called a very difficult. It's actually referred to as a wicked problem. A wicked problem is when there's no obvious solution that will appease everyone. We could well get to some kind of form of which, the United States does not do freedom of navigation exercises, but China ratchets down from its aggressive gray zone activity of its fishing fleet and its coast guard. The exclusive economic zones of smaller countries are honored, but China gets some form of assurance of military maybe a sort of military neutrality of the South China Sea. I think it's going to be, so that solution is going to be messy. It's not going to be, one wins and one loses. It's going to be some sort of ugly sort of compromise. That would be the way forward. It's on the back burner at the moment. I think so. No one's really all that concerned with it. So that's a good thing. The United States is more involved in the Middle East. China is concerned slightly further north in Taiwan. So there's no major rhetorical or theatrical displays of power at the moment because things are, hot. There's hotter hotspots, so to speak. But my worry is that it's a hotspot that could easily rumble out into a major sort of tectonic explosion in a sense. First World War was started by assassination of a sort of minor royalty in a kind of in the Balkans, and eventually leads to the mass slaughter of World War One. And I worry that South China Sea could be one of those. It could be like the Balkans of the of the present era. It's actually interesting. There's a really good book by Stavridis, who was a former U.S. Admiral, and I think he also led NATO for a while. And him and a co-author wrote a book, and I think it was, forget the date again, I think it was like 2031 was the title. And the assumption was it was about World War III. And World War III starts off in the South China Sea. And by the way, I don't want to give the story away, but it doesn't end well, the book. And that's what I worry about. And Stavridis is not like, is an accomplished naval officer, and his co-writer had a military background. So it wasn't as if it was completely, entirely a work of fiction. It was a work of fiction, but it was informed by sort of military realities on the ground. And that would be my worry, that novel would come true. I think the best hope is nothing much happens and we stumble along the way it is, and eventually we'll get to some fudge solution.
What, in your view, are the most critical steps that need to be taken by all parties involved to prevent a major escalation of conflict in the South China Sea?
I think ASEAN is working on what they're calling a code of conduct. The code of conduct that they're working on, I think, is basically an attempt to legitimize China's claim, sadly. But I think there is an opportunity for a a real and honest code of conduct, which limits an agreement to limit both turning reefs into militarized islands, a limit to the behavior of the Coast Guard and China's gray zone activity of its, fishing fleet, and a code of conduct which it maybe accepts China's claim or need for sense of military security, but also, the honoring the exclusive economic zones of the smaller countries. So I think a code of conduct could be hammered out that would cut down on in the first stage, would cut down on military and neo-military behavior, which reduces the possibility of conflict breaking out into something larger. And then subsequent steps would get to hammer out an agreement about honoring exclusive economic zones while still giving China some sense of security from an aggressive US. And it would need to involve the United States saying, we could back down from theatrical freedom of navigation exercises. So I think a more honest code of conduct that isn't, the ASEAN one is pre-engineered to accept China's claim. I think China's claim needs to be questioned. And I would have thought they can do that. It's not, Nine Dash Line isn't a core issue for the Chinese public as, say, Taiwan is. So at this stage, there's still room for the CCP to kind of turn the core issue, turn down the rhetoric of as a core issue, and maybe into a sort of strategic issue that they can have some compromise from the Nine Dash Line. If they persist with the Nine Dash Line, there is no room for negotiation for the other countries. I think that needs to be some negotiation, assuring China military security, while also ensuring the economic interests of the countries surrounding the sea, and an assurance that the United States will back down from theatrical displays of naval power. That would be a kind of complicated code of conduct in stages.
Beyond the immediate geopolitical concerns, what are the long-term environmental or economic consequences of continued conflict and militarization in the South China Sea that policymakers should be paying more attention to?
So one is the environmental damage of sort of turning, reefs into islands, pouring sand on them, concreting them. It's causing enormous environmental damage, both to the reefs themselves and the reef ecosystems. There's the conflict often doesn't make it easy to get arrangements over fishing, for example, and there's massive overfishing and massive pollution in the South China Sea coming from, the Mekong and different rivers. And so the conflict makes it more difficult to get environmental agreements that will stop overfishing, pollution, clean up the microplastics. So while the maritime claims are being fought out, we're often not providing much space for environmental issues to be addressed, and that mainly, pollution and overfishing. In terms of other economic impacts, one is that as the oil and gas exploitations move further out from the respective coasts of Indonesia or Malaysia or Vietnam, it's within China's Nine Dash Line. And what that will make it difficult to do is to assure foreign investors, and you need large amounts of investment to exploit these oil and gas reserves. Would foreign investors be all that keen in investing in blocks, which they're, the seas are divided into blocks for exploitative exploitation terms, will investors be all that interested in investing large amounts of money in areas where China will start to harass oil and gas exploitation activities? In other words, the Chinese presence will dampen enthusiasm for investment, which will dampen, reduce revenue to these countries. So the conflict has a very real economic impact insofar as it scares off investors.
Any future writing projects of yours that we should know of?
Yeah, I'm always writing. It's like an occupational sort of obsession. So the current one I'm working on, I've just started, is looking at empire. So often empires are considered almost entirely as historical issues, and the dominant theme is the rise and fall. Starts off with Edward Gibbon's rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the end of the Roman Empire. And historians have dominated the discussion of empires and imperial projects. And it's always from a temporal perspective, how they rise up and then something happens and then how they fall. So it's always the rise and fall. And what my book is concerned about is looking at empire as a spatial project. So looking at ideas of core and periphery, tyranny of distance, frontiers and boundaries. So in other words, looking at empire as a geopolitical space and trying to pull together the different histories. It's a kind of ambitious project, and I'm very reliant on other people's work. But often historians, it's not only a rise and fall, but they only look at one empire, right? Because there's a lot to rise and fall of the Incas or the Aztecs or the British Empire. But there's very few sort of thematic studies of empire as a spatial project. So that's what I'm embarking on. I think I've half a first chapter, but it's one of those ones I've started. I'm thinking there's an awful lot of more reading that I have to do. I'm kind of in there. It's like the South China Sea. I've started to wade in at the beach, but I've realized that it's a complicated space, and there's lots of competing claims on it.
That was Professor John Rennie Short, helping us unpack the real dynamics behind the headlines in the South China Sea. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Intellings.